So greetings everyone to our psychology study tonight. So tonight we're going to be studying the topic, the ego. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Anahy. Over to you, Anahy.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again. So I'll just share my screen here. Fabrice, you have to able me to, it says host disabled.
Okay, I just enable you.
All right. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's coming up. Just 1 second.
My image is frozen.
Yeah, it says here, Anahy start screen and sharing, but it's all black.
Are you listening to me, Fabrice?
Yes, I am.
Okay, my screen is frozen. I don't know what happened. I will stop sharing. Let's see. I'll just try again, okay, because it got, the image was frozen. Let me just check my internet. Is everything okay? Let's try again.
Yep, it's working on it.
So, okay, great. So I'll just, is it full screen now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So tonight we are going to talk about the ego. And just to, I like, you know, kind of a continuation, so we can develop our thoughts about going class by class. So I put together here again the slide of the picture of the dragonfly from last class, that in a synchronicity, that the concept we will be talking later on. But I kind of thinking of the dragonfly as our symbol for now, okay, because it was very powerful. And just so we can start, because we are talking about the ego. So to be in contact with the inner and outer world, we need the ego, but we are going to be talking about that. So just this quick reminder that the dragonfly symbolizes change that has its source in mental and emotional maturity and the understanding of the deeper meaning of life, to go beyond what's on the surface and look into the deeper implications and aspects of life, so inner and outer life. But how do we do that? So remember that our dragonfly was golden, so it's golden. It's appearing here in the screen. A color that, spiritually speaking, is related to wisdom, comprehension, and spiritual enlightenment. So the dragonfly's iridescence as an ability, and also the ability to see in all 360 degrees around it that we talked last class, they have to do with one's own abilities of unmasking the real self and removing the doubts one casts on his or her own sense of identity, which means self-discovery and an expansion of our consciousness. So for all of this that our symbol is bringing to us, we need the ego, right? So just before I go to the next slide. So remember that Jung says man's task is to become aware of the contents that press upwards coming from the unconscious, right? And that Joanna says that emerging contents form consciousness, as well as its current contributions will be incorporated into the unconscious. So at this point, we have the ego versus the unconscious, right? They are perceived and felt as opposite things. And we saw that in the book, The Personal Triumph by Joanna, she says, the origin of the ego and consciousness is steeped in the concept that both are related to the myth of creation. Consciousness is being born, is being created, right? So when there was nothing, plunged into the predominant unconscious, they emerge constituting the birth of the ego through the suffering it will face, and its liberation or redemption will only be possible through the different stages of its development. Okay, so I'm bringing this back again so we can now focus on the ego, okay? So in the creation, we saw this last week. I'm just remembering with you all. So in the creation myth, perfection would be in principle characterized by the symbol of the circle, or would be present itself in the form of light, different from the ignorance that would manifest itself as the shadow. This symbol multiplies and becomes complex, starting with the emergence of humanity in a collective form and with the life of the human being in its individual expression. So the development is long and painful because through the symbol that remains in it, the circle, the light, right? The conscious becomes spiritually rich in values, rich in self-awareness. So all these symbols move us, okay, through a richness, to an evolution of consciousness, until we get to be self-aware. So thus the human creature achieves the understanding of his, her own being, making it visible like an object through the representation of the sleeping gods. This is a metaphor, okay? In the internal pantheon of the personal unconscious. This is why these unconscious representations acquire the symbolic expressions of the creative power through the myth itself, art, religion, and language. And through these components, the spirit, creator that it is, makes itself known, objectifying itself, make itself an object to be observed, analyzed, you know, that is becoming identified and very slowly reaching self-consciousness through human consciousness, okay? So I brought this first slides because it was a little complicated, I felt, and for people that don't know the depth psychology and are not used to Jungian terms. So as an example, okay, of the birth of consciousness and the ego that we are going to be looking at more closely, okay? I brought from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, a chapter, some sentence from chapter 1 that Jung called First Years. Jung says, I also recall there are a lot of interesting parts that we are going to be seeing as an example. We are going to be using it as an example. But for now, so Jung says, I also recall from this period, 7 to 9, he was 7 to 9 years old, that I was fond of playing with fire. In our garden, there was an old wall built of large blocks of stone, the interstices of which made interesting caves. I used to tend a little fire in one of these caves, with other children helping me, a fire that had to burn forever, and therefore had to be constantly maintained by our united efforts. No one but myself was allowed to tend this fire. My fire alone was living and had an unmistakable aura of sanctity. Okay, this Jung was 7 years old, people, 7 to 9. So he's talking about his fire, and that he alone tended to the fire, and that the fire had an unmistakable aura of sanctity at this early age. Then he says, in front of this wall was a slope in which was embedded a stone that jutted out, my stone. Often when I was alone, I sat down on this stone and began an imaginary game that went something like this. I am sitting on top of this stone, and it is underneath. But the stone also could say, I, and think, I am lying here on this slope, and he is sitting on top of me. The question then arose, am I the one who is sitting on the stone, or am I the one on which he is sitting? So this is a game that Jung played with himself, okay, in this stone, when he was sitting in this stone in front of the wall where he lit the fire. So we are talking about symbolism, okay? I will just go quickly here, okay, so that we can try to understand a little more of what Joanna is saying. When she says these unconscious representations acquire the symbolic expressions of the creative power through the myth itself, art, religion, and language, and through these components, the spirit, creator that it is, makes itself known, objectifying itself, that is becoming identified, and very slowly reaching self-consciousness through human consciousness. So here we see Jung in contact with his own personal symbols. Remember that when we saw the first sentence of Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, when he says, my life is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious. Okay, and that everything in the unconscious seeks outward manifestation, and the personality too desires to evolve out of its unconscious conditions. Okay, so we are evolving and making consciousness. All of us, all of the psyche, all of our different aspects, and we haven't even talked about the self, okay? So this is we are preparing to talk about. So we are talking now about the personality, about the ego, about consciousness. And we are talking about the child, a 7 to 9 year old child, okay? But see, the child is there, but something else is there. Because this kind of game, this kind of perception, this kind of symbolism doesn't belong exactly to the ego of a child of this age, okay? But the ego is there making the game and thinking about it. So I want you to pay attention to all this, the psyche as a whole. We could say an intelligence, a way of thinking that it's beyond a child of 7 or 9. And also the consciousness, the ego, the consciousness, the ego that is relating to all the experience, the game, the images, okay, and also the symbolism that is being brought from the deep unconscious. So all of this we have in this sentences, okay? So Jung goes on saying this question, okay? So the question was, am I the one who is sitting on the stone, or am I the one on which he is sitting? So this question, just this question always perplexed me, and I would stand up wondering who was what now. The answer remained totally unclear, and my uncertainty was accompanied by a feeling of curious and fascinating darkness. He was only a child, okay, in the ego. But there was no doubt whatsoever that this stone stood in some secret relationship to me. I could sit on it for hours, fascinated by the puzzle it set me. Okay. So I brought to you a little bit. The link is here behind in the bottom of the slide. A little bit about the symbolism of the fire. So in this encyclopedia, it says, from time immemorial, man has observed through experience the ambivalent character of fire as a gift of the gods, the source of light and heat. It conditions the sphere of well-being, of life, and of the divine and celestial world. At the same time, as a destructive force, it enters organically into the chaotic and infernal aspects of this world and the next. Prometheus, in stealing fire from heaven, undoubtedly did not think of this destructive side of fire. However, the two forms of the fire interpenetrate. The anger of the God of heaven is armed with lightning. His divine majesty is surrounded by awe-inspiring fire. On the other hand, the violence of devouring fire is not merely negative, for fire can purify, renew, and rejuvenate. So imagine a 7 to 9 year old child with this persistence that Jung had to light fires in the wall. We have the symbolism of the wall too, of the caves. We have lots of symbolism in those memories, Jung's memories, and having to light this fire and tend to the fire and feeling that there was something sacred in the fire without knowing anything about the fire symbolism or the representation in his own life. Okay, so this is very important when we talk about the self too. But for now, I want you to pay attention of this, who was connecting, with the image and tending the fire and playing and thinking all these thoughts, the ego of the child, okay? But there was also somebody or someone else inside Jung's psyche, okay, that was bringing all this symbolism forth from the deep unconscious, okay? So I also brought a sentence by Jung that when he says, and this is for Fabrizio in England, right? The image. So, and the other people that are in England. So the stone symbolized, Jung says, something permanent that can never be lost or dissolved, something eternal that men have compared to the mystical experience of God within one's soul. So at 7 or 9, Jung was sitting on a stone, wondering if who he was. Was he the one that was sitting on the stone? Or was he the stone with the one sitting on him, you know? So it's a very powerful symbol that came from the deep unconscious, and this kind of questions that, as he said, let's just put here, the question perplexed him, and what he says here, that he was curious, and it was accompanied, an uncertainty, it was accompanied by a feeling of curious and fascinated darkness, of course, because he was a 7 or 9-year-old child, okay? But, sorry, I make you, I hope I don't make you dizzy, but there was no doubt whatsoever that this stone stood in some secret relationship to me. So at 7 or 9, he already had enough of ego, okay, to realize that there was a deep and secret relationship to himself of this stone. Okay. So in chapter 2, what he called school years, there are a great experience that happened to him, but we are going to talk about when we talk about the complexes, okay? But for now, I want to show you these sentences. So my school years, so when Jung says, my 12th year was indeed a fateful one for me. This is in the beginning of the chapter. Then a little further, he says that I was walking, this experience, talks about this experience. I was walking the long road to school from Kleinhöningen, I think it's the, how you say, where we lived, to Bazat, when suddenly, for a single moment, I had the overwhelming impression of having just emerged from a dense cloud. I knew all at once, now I am myself. It was as if a wall of mist were at my back. And behind that wall, there was not yet an eye. But at this moment, I came upon myself. Previously, I had existed too, but everything had merely happened to me. Now I happened to myself. Now I knew I am myself now. Now I exist. Previously, I had been willed to do this and that. Now I willed. This experience seemed to me tremendously important and new. There was authority in me. So for Jung, the ego would be a complex of psychic facts formed by a general perception of our body and existence, and afterwards by the registers of our memory. It has a powerful force of attraction of the contents of the unconscious, in addition to calling to itself impressions from the outside world that become conscious upon its contact. So we can see in these examples, okay, because we are talking about childhood, we are talking about adolescence. So we could say, for instance, the powerful force of the ego, of attraction of the contents of the unconscious. We could see that in the Jung's game with when he's sitting in the stone, for instance, right? And also about the fire on the wall. Because the contents that are pressing upwards are from the unconscious. And he is a child in the ego, okay? The ego is 7, 8, or 9 years old. So doesn't know how to translate the experience, but feels the experience, okay? Feels the contents that are pressing upwards, and the impressions, and it's registering the impressions of the experience, okay? Either from the outside world and also what he felt the inside, okay, in the inside. And when he was 12, going out of a mist, okay, we could say, we could see in the first sentence that the ego that would be a complex of psychic facts formed by a general perception of our body and existence. He says here, now I knew I am myself now I exist. It was suddenly a consciousness about himself and his own existence. And I had been previously I had been willed to do this and that. Now I will. This experience seemed to me tremendously important and new. There was authority in me. So we could see that that was a very good example, I think, of the ego complex, okay, about what we call the center of consciousness, the ego. So the ego is the center of consciousness, responsible for organizing the conscious psyche, but it is not identical to it, okay? It is the center. Although it occupies a small part of the total psyche, the ego performs the basic function of watching over consciousness. Jung was very aware of those experiences, so much so that he put in his autobiography, okay? He made an impact, a memory. So the ego for sure was registering and was watching over consciousness, what was going on. So what is not recognized by the ego, be it an idea, a feeling, a memory, or a perception, does not reach consciousness. Remember last class? So it stays in the unconscious, doesn't get energy enough, psychic energy enough to stay or even to go and come up, okay, and rise to our consciousness. So the ego has to recognize an idea, a feeling, a memory, or a perception so that it can be part of consciousness. So the ego for Jung is the subject of all our adaptation attempts. He developed, the ego, it develops for an adaptation in life, okay? It selects all psychic material that enters consciousness. So that's why, and I think this is next class, that we'll be talking about the mechanisms of defense that Freud and Anna Freud elaborate, okay? Because now we can understand that it's the ego that selects all psychic material that enters consciousness. What the ego is afraid of, rejects, so he will deny, repress, and other ways of protecting itself and not allowing it these contents to enter consciousness. It is the ego that provides the personality with identity and continuity. So what I will remember, for instance, this class, the contents that you will remember from our class, okay, from what we are talking about, it will depend on the ego. So that's why I told you, let's relax. And now I'm thinking, Fabrizio, we have to think with everybody else that we thought about doing a little meditation in the beginning of the classes. So meditation, for instance, is a way to kind of calm the ego, okay? To slow it a little bit so it doesn't get to watch and to be so anxious. Will I understand? Will I not understand? We want here to understand with the ego not defending itself so much. So understand with the whole of the psyche, if we could say that, understand with our souls and not so much with our ego, what Joanna is telling us, or in what we reflect together. So it is important to understand that the ego is selecting what enters consciousness.
She froze. Hello? Hi.
Yeah, let's meditate, Daniel.
Yes, Fabrizio.
Okay. So there's a storm coming. So let's use as a synchronicity that the internet went out. Okay, the ego is defending itself. I hope. I hope not. Let's get less defensive. So, we are talking about that is the ego that provides the personality with identity and continuity. It is through the ego that we develop the sense of existing. So the ego is very important. Let's just see, Fabrizio, what happened here. Oops, sorry. Okay. Now, Fabricio, I can see only you. I don't know what I have done, but it's okay. Can you see me? Everybody can see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
There is an
Okay,
option. There is an option in your view that you can select speaker, gallery, or immersive. So you probably select speaker. If you click on gallery, you can see everyone.
Okay, but I don't know where we are now, so I'm not going to touch anything
Okay.
for now. Okay, so let's just okay. So in Personal Triumph, Joanna de Angelis says, the conquest of consciousness is a very painful birth of the unconscious, which continues to hold a significant part of the psychic contents that the ego needs and must assimilate. In that moment, when it becomes aware of the portentous repository and begins to express itself through it, consciousness manifests itself. Okay? So Joanna is talking about the birth of, conquest of consciousness, that it's a very painful birth of the unconscious. Okay, so that this consciousness can arise from the unconscious and hold a significant part of the psychic contents. It needs the ego, okay? The ego needs to hold these psychic contents and assimilate them. Because remember, people, if it's not perceived by the ego, okay, and if the ego doesn't the ego is selecting the material that enters consciousness. So let's just go like here. What is not recognized by the ego, okay, it's not perceived by the ego, does not reach consciousness. So that's why Joanna is saying that the ego needs to hold the psychic contents and assimilate them, okay, in a way that it can be in consciousness, all these contents.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you sharing the screen? Because people are asking you if you can share the slides again.
I'm not sharing. I thought I was.
No.
Oh, something must have happened. Are you looking at the slides, Fabricio?
No, we can't see the slides at the moment.
Oh, I thought we were. So can you stop recording so I can see what happened?
Yeah, one second.
Okay. Should I think I'll just go to, where do you stop? Have everybody seen this slide? The conquest of consciousness? Was
yes.
it? Okay. So this does not mean that the inexistence of the predominance of the personal and collective unconscious. Sorry, it's not. But it does mean that an advanced step has been achieved towards self-awareness, personal enrichment of values, responsibility, well-directed searches, the need for understanding and observing existential meaning. What Joanna is talking here, the conquest of consciousness. And so the part of the ego, the participation of the ego in this birth of consciousness, okay, that it's painful, because you see the work that the ego has to do to hold a significant part of the psychic contents and also assimilate these contents. So in that moment, Joanna says, when it becomes aware of the portentous repository and begins to express itself through it, consciousness manifests itself. And remember Jung there, okay? When Jung, at 12 years old, got out of the mist and said, oh, I exist, okay? And I have authority over myself, okay? So I have my will. So let's see. So Joanna says, this does not mean the inexistence of the predominance of the personal and collective unconscious. Remember in the structure of the psyche that we saw, the personal, and remember the iceberg, the personal and the collective unconscious are, they don't have limits. They are a vast space that it's unlimited. We cannot say where it starts and where it ends. So it is predominant in comparison to consciousness, and especially to the ego. Remember a man in his symbols in Von Franz's chapter that she has that image of a sphere, and the ego is just a small dot, let's say, okay, like a moon circulating, but it's just a small part of consciousness. So, of course, there's the predominance is of the personal and collective unconscious, but it does mean that an advanced step has been achieved towards self-awareness when the ego can hold all these psychic contents. Personal enrichment of values, because it assimilates, the experience, the meaning, the feelings, the symbols, the images. So it's evolving the ego by allowing in us these contents to be in the consciousness and to be assimilated. So they are the ego is helping the personal enrichment of values, responsibility, well-directed searches, the need for understanding and observing existential meaning. Okay, so it's a lot of tasks for the ego. So consciousness is, according to Joanna, therefore, this very high value that we conquer in our evolutionary path, integrating all the patrimony of psychic contents that exists in the reality of discernment besides or beyond knowledge, of feelings in harmony with instincts, of well-directed reasoning. So this is a sentence of Joseph Campbell saying, how to, in The Hero of a Thousand Faces, how to get rid of the ego as a dictator and turn it into a messenger, a servant, and a patroller to serve us. That's the trick. And then Joanna says, in the face of the illusion about the permanence of the somatic set in which the spirit moves on earth, so the permanence of our somatic set of our bodies and everything that comes together with this perception of our bodies, of being here in the matter, in which the spirit moves on earth, mistaken impressions of perenniality are fixed around everything that, after all, is transitory. The false idea around pleasure and the desire for self-satisfaction stimulate ambition for possession and the consequent conduct that imposes hoarding things to which attributes exaggerate value. it attributes exaggerate value. So what does Joanna mean with that? That if the ego gets like too identified with the experience here of he's the center of consciousness of our personality, okay? We could say our personality. So if it gets too identified and with the material experience, with our somatic set, okay, and gets in this illusion that we are only that we are our how we feel and how we see, how we understand ourselves, okay? Understand in a sense of how I am, my identity for the world, okay? And these mistaken impressions that this is perennial, that this is forever, okay? And that we have to, if the ego exaggerates that and it's in this illusion, gets in this illusion, so a very materialistic, so in that I have to satisfy myself, okay? I need to satisfy myself. So I will be, I will stimulate ambitions for possession, material possessions, and I will try to get together. I will try to pay attention of what on what I have, not on what I am, especially not on what I am within. Okay, so the inner vision that we are all trying to, so self-discover, to turn our visions to the inside, not so much to the outside, okay? So then the ego attributes exaggerated values to this kind of thing and forgets or try to forget or defend itself much more against the contents that are pressing from inside. And you see, from all that we are learning about Jung and about Joanna, this is a big problem, because then we are not helping to expand our consciousness. We are actually reducing our consciousness to what I can perceive with my senses and how I can relate it to the world with my senses, but not, with my intuitions, not with my images, my symbols. So I reduce the understanding of who I am, who the other people are, what we are doing all here, okay, what all of us are doing here. So in Reflecting the Soul, a beautiful book that will, of course, be translated to English in due time, that is the group of psychologists, Gelson and other people that wrote some years ago. People say the imperious need for survival of the ego. I think it's Gelson and Marlon that in this chapter. So the imperious need for survival of the ego, the fear of failing, of not getting it right, of not being considered the greatest or the best, make people create an impeding barrier to the development of the potentialities that lay latent in human beings. So you see how awful can be, for instance, in our technological world, that we are in the internet all the time and in different kind of social medias, paying so much attention to what people think of what we say and how our images that we send for Instagram or whatever. And so the ego is looking outside, okay? And if we let the ego in this desperate attempt, I should say, to some people, to be recognized by the outer world, we totally forget the inner world, that it's there in the unconscious, that as we've seen and we are going to be seeing further ahead, that it's what we really are, okay? So when we talk about how we think we are talking about the subjective psyche, not the objective psyche. But I'm not going to get into this so I don't make you confused. But only to say that what we think we are is subjective. Our truth is not out there as in a series from the past, okay? But it's inside of us, okay? It's not the truth in our case, the truth is not out there. The truth is in there, inside of us, okay? In here, let's say, inside of us. So all these fears that we have, especially nowadays, you know, fear of failing, of not getting it right, of not being considered the greatest or the best. So it will only create this barrier to our development that lay within us, all of us, okay, and the unconscious. So remember our dragonfly, and remember when the dragonfly appeared. I was wondering, actually the ego was there pretty much, okay, because I was wondering with so many questions, what about, maybe I was not clear, you know, that was the ego. Was I clear enough? Or asking Joanna, am I a good teacher? You know, wondering about that. Can people understand what I'm saying or not? So this was all the ego. So what happens is that we have another intelligence, if we can say, thanks God, if we can say that is bringing, and we're going to be talking about this later, bringing contents there from deep unconscious and making it visible, but the ego has to perceive, okay? So I told you I was waking up in the morning and I opened the door and there the dragonfly was. So probably since I was a little sleepy, my ego was not so active as the previous night, okay? Or in the at night when I went to sleep. So then I could contact with the symbol of the dragonfly that was there in a synchronicity. So we need the ego to calm down, okay? So it can listen to this inner voice that can manifest itself in the world. This is very important, but so every time the ego expands or takes over the subject, every time it determines the human being's behavior and acts by itself solely in terms of its pleasure, it prevents the divine part that exists in us from manifesting itself. Okay, this is a continuation of the previous reflection that I think Gelson and Marlon, the authors of this chapter, made in this chapter of reflecting the soul. So the ego, it's very important, as we saw, has to have its place and has to be mature, has to be strong, okay, has to live life. Remember one of the sentences in the beginning of our studies where Jung's talking the Red Book to his soul, and that when he says that living this life is the way to the divine that we call God, something like that. It's because the ego has to do its task of living this life, of allowing consciousness to expand, okay? Slowing down in terms of anxieties and fears, okay? And every time it determines the human's being's behavior and acts by itself, if the ego thing, it's the king, let's say, of I am, you know, I am the, okay, Jung, 12 years old, he had to, at 12 years old in adolescence, we have to find ourselves for the personality to go on. So the ego has to work through adolescence to get to, you know, maturity and to being adult and going on in life, okay, having the experiences and all. But the ego has, you know, to acknowledge that it it's not the only part of our psyche, okay? And if it goes in the other direction, thinking it is I am and I'm the whole of the psyche, it prevents the divine part that exists in us from manifesting itself. And there is this beautiful sentence by Jung, okay, when Jung says, I'm not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. And I think this is very important because what happens to me in this life, the ego is living the experience. And if we work in our egos to mature it, you know, to make it humble, we can say, to make it understand that there are inner parts of myself that connects to the divine, okay, to the transcendent, to the, okay, that is actually connected and part of the collective unconscious, the transpersonal, what we call the transpersonal dimension of the psyche. So, of course, there will be a much more mature ego and a much stronger ego. As I told you, all the research data in, you know, the last past 20 years in this psychiatric and psychological field are demonstrating that a person with a developed spirituality and that searches meaning and purpose in life has a much more mature ego, okay, and a much stronger ego. So then we can understand what Jung said, that we are not what happened to us. Doesn't matter what kind of suffering we go through our lives, okay? But if I go with this maturity, if I go through life with this maturity and with less fear, to acknowledge myself actually, to listen to my inner world, then I am what I choose to become. Then I have the will, okay? And I'm not dependent on other people's and what other people think about me, and not even what the fears of the ego, okay? The fears of the ego, oh, will I be competent in what I'm doing? Will people like me or not? Because I choose to become, okay? So let's think of what Jung's saying here. Let me just stop sharing. I think we could start now in the questions. I don't know if we stop recording, Fabricio, what do you think?
Yeah, okay. So I will say goodbye to the ones that is listening to us. And if you want to raise a question, please raise your hand and I will stop the recording now.
Okay, so goodbye to everybody that are at home.